The mansion was silent in a way that felt unnatural, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The billionaire had returned hours earlier than planned, his mind still occupied with boardroom victories and billion-dollar decisions, unaware that the most important reckoning of his life was waiting behind his own front door. As he stepped inside, something felt wrong. The air was heavy, tense, and disturbingly quiet. Then he saw her. The woman who had raised him, loved him, and sacrificed everything for him was sitting in the living room, trembling, restrained, and humiliated in the very house he had built to honor her. And standing nearby was the one person he trusted the most, his wife. Before we continue this powerful story, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Black Voice Story for more emotional and thought-provoking stories that matter. Marcus Ellington had spent his entire life proving that he belonged in rooms that were never designed for people like him. Born into poverty in a neighborhood shaped by neglect and systemic inequality, he grew up surrounded by barriers that were invisible to some but suffocating to others. His earliest memories were not of toys or playgrounds, but of resilience, discipline, and the unwavering presence of one woman who refused to let the world define his worth. That woman was Evelyn Carter. She was not his biological mother, but in every way that mattered, she was the foundation of his life. A black woman who worked multiple jobs as a domestic helper, caregiver, and cleaner. She adopted Marcus when he was just 6 years old after he had spent years moving between unstable foster homes. She saw something in him that others overlooked: quiet intelligence, emotional depth, and a hunger for something greater. Evelyn raised him with dignity, even when the world treated her with anything but. She endured discrimination in workplaces where her effort was praised but her humanity was ignored. She was called invisible in rooms where she was essential, and underestimated in spaces where she was the strongest presence. Yet, despite every injustice she faced, she never allowed bitterness to shape her love. Marcus watched it all. He watched how she stood tall, even when customers refused to look at her. He watched how employers spoke over her, as if her voice carried less value. He watched how society reduced her to a role instead of recognizing her as a person. And deep inside, those moments planted a silent promise. One day, he would build a life with a woman who raised him would never be disrespected again. Through scholarships, relentless study, and a work ethic forged through hardship, Marcus climbed academic ladders that were statistically designed to exclude people from his background. He excelled in finance, entrepreneurship, and strategic leadership, eventually founding a technology investment firm that grew into a multi-billion-dollar empire. His success was not sudden. It was built brick by brick, through sleepless nights, rejection letters, racial bias in corporate circles, and constant pressure to outperform just to be seen as equal. Despite his wealth, Marcus never forgot where he came from. When his company finally went public and he became one of the youngest black billionaires in the country, his first major purchase was not a sports car or a private jet. It was a home, a massive estate in an affluent neighborhood where security, privacy, and luxury existed in abundance. But to Marcus, it was not about status. It was about protection. It was about giving Evelyn the life she deserved after decades of sacrifice. He insisted she move in with him permanently, transforming a wing of the mansion into a comfortable sanctuary tailored to her needs. He hired caregivers, arranged regular medical checkups, and made sure she was treated with respect by every staff member. To him, she was not just family. She was the reason he existed in that world at all. Years later, Marcus married Isabella Clark, a woman from a wealthy and socially prominent background. On the surface, she appeared refined, supportive, and understanding of Marcus's journey. She attended charity galas with him, smiled beside him during interviews, and publicly praised his story of resilience. Their marriage was widely admired in elite circles, often portrayed as a symbol of progress and modern unity. But beneath the polished image, subtle tensions existed. Isabella had grown up in privilege, in environments where domestic staff were present but never personally acknowledged. Her worldview was shaped by comfort, status, and social expectations that were deeply ingrained over generations. While she never openly disrespected Evelyn in Marcus's presence, there were moments, small, fleeting, and easily dismissed, where her tone carried a quiet superiority. At first, Marcus ignored those moments. He assumed they were misunderstandings, cultural differences, or the awkward adjustments of a newly blended household. He believed love and time would smooth out any rough edges. After all, he had built an empire by believing in long-term solutions rather than reactive judgments. For months, the household functioned peacefully on the surface. Staff reported directly to Isabella regarding daily operations when Marcus was traveling for business, which happened frequently due to the global expansion of his company. Evelyn, now older and more physically fragile, spent most of her days resting, reading, or watching television in the sunlit sitting room that overlooked the garden. Everything seemed stable until the subtle changes began. Caregivers started resigning unexpectedly. House staff rotated more frequently than usual. And Evelyn, who once radiated warmth and calm, became quieter during Marcus's brief visits home. Her posture changed. Her smile faded. Her eyes carried a weight that Marcus noticed but could not immediately explain. Each time he asked if everything was all right, she simply reassured him with gentle composure, never wanting to create conflict in the household he had worked so hard to build. Marcus believed her. He wanted to believe her. But sometimes the truth hides behind silence, especially when silence is chosen to protect someone else's peace. And on the day Marcus came home early, that silence finally shattered. Marcus's return that afternoon was unplanned. A high-level meeting in another city had been canceled due to unforeseen corporate complications, and instead of notifying anyone, he decided to surprise his family. It had been weeks since he had last spent uninterrupted time at home, and the thought of seeing Evelyn relaxed and happy filled him with rare anticipation. As his car approached the mansion gates, he noticed something unusual. The usual warmth that came with arriving home felt absent. The staff's movement seemed hurried, almost nervous, and there was an unspoken tension in their expressions as they greeted him. Inside the mansion, the silence was unsettling. Normally, the sound of soft music or television echoed gently through the halls when Evelyn was awake. But that day, the house felt eerily still. Marcus walked to the marble corridors, his footsteps echoing louder than usual, his instincts sharpening with each passing second. Then he heard a faint sound, not conversation, not laughter, a restrained movement. He followed it instinctively toward the main living room, his heart rate slowly increasing as an unfamiliar sense of dread crept into his chest. The closer he got, the more the atmosphere felt heavy, charged with something deeply wrong. When he stepped into the room, the sight before him froze time itself. Evelyn was seated on a chair near the center of the room. Her posture was rigid, her hands loosely restrained to prevent her from standing. Her expression was not loud or dramatic, but quiet and deeply wounded. Her eyes, once full of warmth, now reflected humiliation and exhaustion. Across the room stood Isabella. She was composed, elegant, and calm, as if nothing unusual was happening. Yet the dynamic in the room spoke louder than any explanation ever could. A caregiver stood nearby, hesitant and visibly uncomfortable, as if caught in a situation she did not fully agree with but felt powerless to challenge. Marcus's mind struggled to process the scene. This was the woman who raised him, the woman he had promised to protect, the woman whose sacrifices were the foundation of his entire existence. And she was being treated as an inconvenience in her own home. In the days that followed his return, Marcus began to observe more closely. He did not react immediately. Instead, he paid attention to patterns, subtle behavioral shifts, changes in staff dynamics, the way caregivers interacted with Evelyn, the way Isabella referred to her in private discussions about household management. What he discovered was deeply disturbing. Under the justification of maintaining order in the household, Isabella had gradually begun exerting strict control over Evelyn's daily routine. Her mobility was restricted under the pretense of safety. Her interactions with staff were limited under the guise of efficiency. Her independence, dignity, and autonomy had slowly been reduced in ways that were not physically violent, but emotionally degrading. It was not loud abuse. It was quiet control, the kind that hides behind polished language and socially acceptable reasoning, the kind that can be dismissed as caregiving concern by outsiders, but felt like erasure by the person experiencing it. Marcus also learned that several caregivers had left because they were uncomfortable with how Evelyn was being treated when he was away. Some had attempted to express concern, but were dismissed as overstepping their roles. Others simply chose to resign rather than remain complicit. And Evelyn, true to her lifelong nature, had remained silent. She had endured decades of societal disrespect. She had survived discrimination in workplaces and public spaces. And now, in the very home meant to honor her sacrifices, she was quietly enduring another form of dehumanization, not because she was weak, but because she did not want to be the reason her son's marriage collapsed. Marcus's internal conflict intensified. He replayed every past interaction, every subtle remark, every moment he had dismissed as minor. The realization that racial bias could exist in subtle domestic power structures within his own home shook him deeply. It was not overt hatred. It was something more insidious. The unconscious devaluation. The confrontation was not explosive in the traditional sense. It was controlled, deliberate, and deeply emotional. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not act impulsively. Instead, he gathered documented evidence, staff accounts, and medical records, ensuring that his understanding of the situation was based on undeniable facts rather than assumptions. His approach reflected the same strategic precision that built his empire, but this time, the stakes were profoundly personal. When the moment finally came, the atmosphere in the mansion shifted permanently. Marcus arranged for Evelyn to be moved comfortably to her private suite, ensuring she was surrounded by caregivers who genuinely respected her dignity. Medical professionals conducted independent evaluations, confirming that the restrictive measures imposed on her were unnecessary and psychologically harmful rather than beneficial. The findings were clear. What had been framed as structured care was, in reality, excessive control. Marcus then reviewed months of internal security footage and staff reports that revealed a consistent pattern of dismissive behavior toward Evelyn whenever he was absent. The footage did not show dramatic incidents. It showed something more painful, a gradual erosion of respect, a tone of authority that treated Evelyn as subordinate rather than honored. That realization struck Marcus harder than any financial loss or professional setback he had ever faced. He had built his entire life around protecting the dignity of the woman who saved him. And while he was conquering boardrooms across the world, her dignity had been quietly compromised under his own roof. The emotional breaking point came when he sat alone in Evelyn's room and observed the subtle changes in her demeanor. She was more hesitant, more withdrawn, less expressive. The vibrant strength that once defined her had been replaced by cautious restraint, not because of age alone, but because prolonged emotional invalidation leaves invisible scars. Marcus understood then that this was not just a domestic issue. It was a reflection of a broader societal pattern where elderly black individuals. In the weeks that followed, the mansion felt different, not just quieter, healthier. Evelyn's transformation was gradual but profound, with respectful caregivers, increased autonomy, and an environment centered on dignity rather than control. Her natural warmth slowly returned. She began spending time in the garden again, reading near the windows, and engaging more openly with staff who now treated her with genuine admiration. Marcus, despite his demanding schedule, adjusted his priorities significantly. He reduced unnecessary travel, delegated more corporate responsibilities, and made it a personal commitment to remain more present in the space that mattered most. His success had always been measured in financial metrics, but now he began redefining success as emotional responsibility and ethical leadership within his own household. Beyond the walls of the mansion, the experience deeply influenced his philanthropic direction. Marcus expanded his foundation's initiatives to focus on elder dignity, caregiver accountability, and racial bias in domestic and healthcare environments. Research partnerships were established to study how systemic biases affect elderly black individuals in private care settings. Advocacy programs were launched to educate families about respectful caregiving practices rooted in dignity and cultural sensitivity. What began as a painful personal discovery evolved into a broader mission for social awareness and reform. Evelyn's story became a quiet but powerful symbol, not of victimhood, but of resilience, endurance, and the silent strength that many marginalized elders carry without recognition. Her life represented generations of black women who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, nurturing futures that society rarely credited them for. Marcus often reflected on a single truth that reshaped his perspective forever. Wealth can build walls, but only awareness can protect the people inside them. He realized that injustice does not always appear in loud, obvious forms. Sometimes it manifests through subtle control, unconscious bias, and a quiet normalization of unequal treatment within personal spaces. And confronting it requires courage not just in public, but in private.